Good afternoon, Jambo, Bonjour, Ekaro, wherever you find yourself in the world today. Welcome to the Conversation Africa's virtual seminar series. Today you've joined us for the discussion titled Reality Check. Is South Africa's climate change adaptation plan still fit for purpose? Now, in the last 3 years, South Africa has seen an increase in extreme weather events, from flash floods to tornadoes, severe storms and hurricanes. Each time one of these events strike, tens of millions of rands of infrastructure, such as roads, buildings, and bridges, get affected. And these extreme weather events are expected to increase in frequency, in intensity, in spatial extent, duration, and timing as the climate continues to warm. It's clear that something needs to be done. Now, climate change adaptation measures is no longer just a buzzword, but today you're going to hear from the experts exactly how South Africa is managing this. This webinar is brought to you by The Conversation Africa. My name is Candice Bailey. I'm the Strategic Initiatives Editor at The Conversation, and today I'm joined by Environment and Energy Editor Anna Weeks. Anna, are you there?
Hi Candice. Hi, everyone.
How's the weather in Makanda today, Anna?
There's no drought and there's no flood, so it's pretty good. Thank you. How's your weather?
It's sunshine, blue skies in Johannesburg. So, guys, we're going to hear from Anna very soon. But before I hand over to her, there are a couple of announcements that I want to make. The first is that this is the third virtual event in the Conversations virtual seminar series that's been going on for the last 3 weeks. The final event takes place next week. It's titled The Green Switch: How Viable is South Africa's Move to Clean Energy? You can register for that event. The link should be in your chat. But Gary should put it in the chat right now. The second is that questions can be dropped into the Q&A. So during the panel discussion, and I'll introduce our panel very shortly, you can drop questions in and we'll moderate those to make sure that the panel members get it. The third is that the hashtag for today is reality check. So if you're posting on social media, please use the hashtag. The last announcement for today is that this event is being live streamed on the Conversation Africa's Facebook page. So please share the link for your friends and family if you want them to watch. And if you have a burning question, drop it into the comment section and we'll be able to pick it up too. Now, for the next hour or so, we're going to go into what we call at the conversation a no acronym zone, or we're going to try to get as close to it as possible. And to do that and to help us learn about climate change adaptation, we've got 4 amazing experts with us. I'm going to ask our guests to switch on their cameras so that I can introduce themselves. Professor Kaitano Dube, Dr. Samkelisiwe Khanyile, Dr. Kira Erwin, and Brandon Abdinor. Can I ask you to turn on your screens? Thank you so much. Welcome so much to our panel discussion today. Now, just some brief notes on the panel, colleagues. Professor Kaitano Dube is one of South Africa's leading tourism geographers. He's currently located at the Vaal University of Technology. He's a National Research Foundation rated scholar, and his research focus areas, among others, is climate change. He's also a visiting professor at Emirates Aviation University in Dubai. He's an independent research consultant for UNISA, and he's an honorary visiting faculty research professor at Changi University in India. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Prof. Dube has published more than 50 journal articles and more than 60 book chapters, and he's edited more than 11 books. He's got quite a significant resume. Next up, we've got Dr. Kira Erwin. She's a sociologist, a researcher, a scholar activist with over 12 years of experience supporting social and environmental justice efforts in her home city of Durban. She's currently the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research and Learning Coordinator at groundWork. Third on the panel, we've got Brandon Abdinor. I nearly called you Professor, Brandon. He joined the Centre for Environmental Rights as a climate advocacy lawyer in 2021, where he engages with climate change-related laws and policies to ensure that they are effective and that they advance the needs of climate justice for all. Since March last year, Brandon has been acting as the lead for the Pollution and Climate Change Program, overseeing the team's strategic litigation and legal advocacy initiatives. He obtained his LLB from the University of Witwatersrand and was admitted as an attorney in 1998. He's been a keen student of climate change issues since 2004, when he wove climate change response into his work, before pivoting to climate and environmental activism full-time in 2020. Last and certainly not least, we've got Dr. Samkelisiwe Khanyile, who's a researcher at the Gauteng City Region Observatory. She holds a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand. Her research interests center around investigating the applications of geographic information systems, GIS, remote sensing, and similar data analytics technologies to inform sustainable and just urban development and planning. Welcome so much, colleagues. How are you all? Professor Dube, Dr. Kira?
We're good, thanks, and
Very good.
good afternoon to your viewers and the audience.
Dr. Kira, you there? Brandon and Dr. Sam?
Yes, thanks. Hi, everyone.
All good. Hi, all.
So, colleagues, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand over to you very shortly. Just to tell our viewers, if you just joined us, the webinar is brought to you by the Conversation Africa. You can sign up for our daily newsletter or our bi-weekly WhatsApp updates. If you missed the QR code at the beginning of the webinar, keep your phone handy at the end. We'll play the QR codes again, and then you can sign up for those prompts. Now, I think that's been enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Anna now. Anna, climate change adaptation measures is probably an issue that's very close to your heart, living in Makanda, in the Eastern Cape, where we've seen lots of droughts.
Yes, indeed, Candice. Thank you so much. And again, a warm welcome to all our panelists and viewers. We'll get right into it very soon. First, just to say, as you all know, climate-related disasters have come to really dominate the disaster landscape globally. They now make up more than 80% of all reported disasters worldwide, according to the Centre for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters. The frequency, extent, severity of these disasters have increased notably over the last several years. And of course, huge economic losses have resulted and have increased. So our conversation today will be about how South Africa should be adapting to these climate change disasters. Dr. Khanyile will keep you for last to talk about some specific solutions projects that you're very much involved in. And for now, let's get into it with our experts. Of course, when it comes to climate adaptation, the most important thing that needs to happen is eliminating the use of fossil fuels to prevent the climate from getting even hotter. But then we also come to things that can be done at the same time, such as greening cities so they can absorb more flood water, conducting risk-informed urban planning, introducing new types of drainage systems, rehabilitating wetlands, including urban wetlands to absorb floodwaters. So let's talk about whether these things are happening and how they should be happening. South Africa has a national climate change adaptation strategy. It was devised in 2019, and it's supposed to provide all levels of government with common reference points for the kinds of projects they should already be designing and implementing to adapt South Africa to climate change. I think let's start with Brandon for about 7 minutes. Brandon, if you could tell us all, just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy? Where are we with it now? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and hi, everyone again. So the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy and Plan, as it's called, is supposed to be a common vision that outlines priority areas and ensures that adaptation measures start taking place. According to the document itself, the government has had climate adaptation needs and risk assessment on the map since the late 90s. I can't vouch for that, but I don't necessarily doubt it either. And then this plan has its roots in a few foundational documents. The first is the National Climate Change Response Plan of 2011. I'm trying to avoid those acronyms. Also the National Development Plan, also from 2011, and then the National Sustainable Strategy, or National Strategies, Sustainable Strategy and Development from 2011 as well. It's also South Africa's adaptation plan in terms of our commitments under the Paris Agreement. So Article 7.11 says that each of the treaty signatories need to submit to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change its adaptation plan, and this plan has been submitted there in 2020 as well. So in terms of spread, I'd say from a very high level, the spread is sound. It really does attempt to cover the main kind of aspects that need to be taken into consideration. And the sections include a context, so it'll look at the global context, including the sort of global diplomatic context, and it references the Paris Agreement there, and then the South African context in terms of physical risks from climate change impacts. It then goes on to cover a strategic focus, which is a relatively small section, and that's really kind of almost a statement of intent, which is to really build climate resilience for the country. It then has a section on reducing vulnerability and building adaptive capacity, and those are broken down into humans, people, and the economy as well. It then talks about climate services. So these are the early warning systems and there are actually quite a range of them, and itemizes those and talks about those as being our climate services that are needed. It then talks about the climate risk and vulnerability assessment framework. So it recognizes that there are climate risk assessment activities that have taken place and vulnerability assessments, but also recognizes that these are not a cohesive whole at this point in time, and the need to unify those different disparate pieces and bring them together. It then talks about research, so really sort of catalyzing research and technological advancement in the field. Then speaks about awareness and capacity building. So really, how do we mainstream knowledge around climate change impacts across different actors and sectors? Then talks about governance building and legislation. So in other words, what sort of regulations and laws do we need to pull all of this necessary adaptation activity together? It speaks about finance, and then monitoring and evaluation, and then an implementation framework. So it sounds like it's very holistic and comprehensive, and in a sense, from a very high level, one can't critique it from that point of view. It is in fact that. But it also reads as a wish list. It's very aspirational. It talks a lot about developing and instituting and establishing and all of these different things that need to happen. And then if we measure that against our experience on the ground, for example, we know that much of the meat that needs to be put onto this skeleton is still to be done. A lot of its high-level statements are very good. It speaks about climate change as an opportunity to develop socially and spatially. It recognizes the threats to water, food, natural resources, and infrastructure. It recognizes the linkage between climate change impacts and development, and urges that funding for development needs to weave climate change adaptation into it. It speaks about using the best available science as well as indigenous knowledge, which is really strong. Also very strong initially on talking about participatory democracy and very much a bottom-up approach. Yeah, and then also mentions equity and gender response, climate smart and conservation agriculture. So really saying the right things. If one looks at this and considers what sort of common sense best practice would be, it is fair to say that a lot of this is covered in there. Notwithstanding that it would need to be updated, and there are some key areas in which we can see that it's out of date. So those are the good things, and I think I'll save the critiquing for some of the later sections where we ask whether it's fit for purpose. Thanks.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, I think that's a very good base for us to start from. It is a good spread, as you say, of things that we need to in order to adapt to the climate change, and we'll get a bit more into the criticism later on. But for now, I think Professor Dube, can you come in here and please outline to us some of the major extreme weather events and disasters that have happened, and how have we adapted to them? Have we adapted at all? What has been done, and are we in a position to prevent those from happening again? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much, Brandon, for that introduction. I think over the past couple of the past decades, we have seen an increase, I think, like what we have heard in the introduction with regards to the number of extreme weather events that we have experienced, particularly in South Africa, and also the continent as a whole and the world at large. What we are seeing, I think, is what was not anticipated when the climate adaptation strategy was developed, which was actually based on AR5. And now we have got AR6, which means that there's need for us to really revisit and look at what are some of the developments that we have seen. But what we have seen, particularly, let's try to look at we have experienced, I think, one of the worst drought that affected Cape Town. I think the day zero phenomena that became almost a global event in terms of climate extremes, where the city of Cape Town and Western Cape in particular was actually threatened with running out of water. We have also seen the Durban floods are quite monumental in many respects, where I think an extreme amount of rainfall that fell within a very short period of time, resulting in a record high flooding. And I think there's actually evidence to indicate that this event was largely driven in part by climate change. But what we have also seen is an increase in the hurricanes and the tropical cyclones that actually affect South Africa, particularly if you look at the eastern coastal area, running all the way to, I think, the Limpopo province and the Mpumalanga province. And in many respects, we have seen these tropical cyclones both increasing in terms of their intensity with high confidence. We have also seen, I think, the impact of sea level rising and also coastal erosion increasing at a rate, I think, that was not anticipated. Most of us will still recount, I think, the events that happened in September last year, when we saw, I think, monumental tides that affected the coastal cities and also the coastal communities. And this could actually also be attributed to, I think, the increase in climate change. But what we have also seen is the increased incidence, intensity, duration of fire activities across the length and breadth of our country, all the way from Eastern Cape, Western Cape. I think we have just witnessed, I think, quite high number of mortality in KZN as a result of fires. South Africa, particularly in the last year, a combination of climate change and also the El Nino phenomena, we have seen an increase in the number of heat waves that have affected the country, which is actually problematic in many respects. So the list goes on and on. In the past couple of months, we have seen a record number of cut-off laws. And because of we can now almost instantly pick up some of these things. We now know that when those cut-off laws occurred, they actually emerged from an ocean that was actually intensified, that at higher temperatures than normal, which became problematic. And I think the list can go on and on. We have seen these extreme weather events. As to whether the country is adapted, I think we need to look at the strategy, the climate change adaptation strategy, and what it sought to do when it was enacted. One of the things that we see is that from the strategy, it sought to reduce the losses and the damages associated with extreme weather events. But what we have seen actually is the opposite, where there has been an increase in terms of the losses and damage that we have experienced from extreme weather events. And I think I'll stop it there for now.
Thanks, Prof. And do you maybe just want to explain what a cutoff low is, please, quickly, before we move on?
So I'm not. These are weather systems, I think, that develops particularly on our coastal communities. And I think I'm not really a meteorologist, but these are systems that ordinarily affect the Eastern Cape and part of the Western Cape, and it emerges mostly as a result of the interaction between the cold and the warm front and the high pressure system, which result in us receiving, I think, excessive amounts of rainfall, particularly in the coastal provinces of Western Cape. And we have seen, I think, some cut-off laws. Part of the Durban floods that we witnessed was a result of a cut-off law that had developed over the Indian Ocean, so to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Dube. That's great. So, Dr. Erwin, let's come to you. We've heard Prof talking about the increase in intensity of tropical cyclones, the increased numbers of wildfires across the country, coastal erosion. Can we bring you in here at this point to talk about climate resilience? Help us understand what climate resilient infrastructure is and why we need it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And let me just say, I sometimes feel uncomfortable when I'm put up as an expert. So these ideas that I'm talking about here actually come from about 2 years of conversations with civil society here in Durban, especially after those April 2022 floods. I think that not any one person living in the city could imagine the type of damage that we saw and the extensive loss of life. And you know, it was really a very tragic moment for our city. So as civil society, we have been doing a lot of thinking, sometimes with local government, other times not. But what is it that we actually need to protect ourselves, people, plants, animals, and our infrastructure in the city? And I think one thing is to get far more pragmatic than what the sort of big abstract policies do, and to ask for new norms and standards for buildings. So, you know, we know that in our particular context, flooding, extreme flooding is probably going to become more common. We also know that we are at risk of high temperatures, and I can't underestimate what heat stress does to people's bodies. It can put you under an extraordinary amount of pressure, those particularly children and the elderly. So what do new norms and standards look like for building? If a developer is coming into your city and putting a proposal on your table, if as local government or arms of the state that regulate, we aren't saying to them, show us how you are mitigating against heat temperatures, or show us how you are using this building so you understand the water flow to ensure that your development is a sponge during flooding, rather than exacerbates issues and actually creates more infrastructure damage. And one of the things that I think we're going to have to get as a society is a new imagination for what infrastructure looks like. Perhaps infrastructure shouldn't be thought of increasingly as big, large, centralized forms of delivering services. If we start to decentralize key infrastructure to think in more modular ways in a city, it will allow areas who are badly hit during extreme weather to bounce back faster. So, for example, if you are able to train up or create community centers where if there's extreme flooding and people have got no electricity or no clean water, how does that module serve a much smaller geography? How can clean water be harvested quickly? Who in this area knows how to hook up the solar system so that we can get a battery to our refrigerator? So people who, for example, are reliant on medication that requires to be kept cold aren't going to be at risk. So I think really thinking through what decentralized infrastructure looks like and how that can help us adapt and mitigate against extreme weather is vitally important. Lastly, let me say that from the view of civil society broadly and social movements, there is certainly an extended hand out to local government to say one of the things that's important is start thinking about us as infrastructure. In all of the weather events that Prof. Dube spoke about, it was really community-based organizations and neighbors who were first responders in these disasters. Actually, people have learned a lot, and they want to contribute to thinking about what community-led disaster management looks like with support from state structures. So I think really seeing communities themselves as a form of infrastructure and how we respond to the increasing risk that are coming our way is really critical. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Erwin. And do you maybe want to expand a bit on that in terms of what communities can do to be part of climate adaptation?
Yeah, sure. I don't mind jumping to that. For example, in eThekwini, and I'm sure this is happening around the country, we really are sort of thinking about how civil society, social movements, and even progressive ratepayers associations can get into conversation with each other, preferably with local government on board, although that's not always the case. But I think that we can start to create a sort of people's planning process that responds to this. What is it that we think are needed? What kind of new governance arrangements would we like to see in our municipality? How do we ensure that some of the plans that have been written up already, but just haven't been implemented in terms of adaptation or resilience, really start to take hold on the ground? Yeah, so I think that there's nothing stopping any of us actually creating a sort of groundswell from below that starts to say, well, it's in our policies, you're mandated to engage with us. Let's engage. We want to be part of planning, decision-making, and monitoring. And in this process, let's capacitate each other so that we know how to respond to these sorts of disasters, and importantly, how to build our infrastructure and our built environment in ways that stop doing harm to people and to planet. Certainly for ourselves in Durban, we've engaged in a people's planning process around the right to housing in an age of climate change. And one of the things we're asking for are sort of dedicated pilot sites where a municipal sort of led high-level climate adaptation working group could actually use to learn with communities. If we have to retrofit, for example, an informal settlement, or retrofit a hostel dwelling units, or retrofit RDP developments, we need to learn, can we protect people more? Kind of infrastructure protects people. Unless we start, I would say quite rapidly, then really what we have all the time is just something written on paper, but not actions, so that we can start to learn how do we keep ourselves safe. And I'll just end by saying that, you know, societies that deal with other forms of disasters like earthquakes, and let's take Japan and Chile here. Recently, I was with Chileans who said that for them, when an earthquake warning comes, they do not run out into the street, which is what we would do, which I would do. I'd be like, get out the building's dangerous, it's going to kill you. For them, they like, stay in building, shelter in place. Why do they do that? Is because all their buildings have been constructed so that they are able to withstand earthquakes and keep people safe. So we need to start thinking like that. When the heat temperature rises, when the floodwaters rise, how are we kept safe through our infrastructure rather than infrastructure becoming an additional risk to us? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Erwin. That's great. So I think we're getting into the nitty-gritty, and the question is probably, how should the government be responding? And is South Africa actually missing out on developing climate resilience? You know, and since if we are missing out, what's going to happen? How do we save thousands of lives and homes when the next disaster strikes? So I think I'll redirect back to Brandon. Brandon, to answer the question of the dialogue, do you think that the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy is fit for purpose? Does it work? And could you give us an outline of its shortcomings?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Anna. Again, just to reiterate, it really is a sort of high-level wish list, and so yeah, I think in critiquing the plan, it's very difficult not to critique implementation, and I think there are problems there. Just in terms of the plan itself, I think it would need to be updated. If this was released in 2019, is probably based on research that was current in sort of 2017, 2018. So much has happened in the meantime, both in terms of scientific understanding of impacts, as well as lessons learned from events around the world. I think this is possibly one of the largest growing fields of knowledge around today. And certainly those sort of updates should be taken into account. Just some examples, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's really the scientific body made up of scientists and authors from around the world that are supposed to synthesize the scientific information and support the sort of political decision making. So since this has been released, there's been the 6th assessments cycle, which has come out. And just looking at a few of the key features from there that are not in this plan. For example, that 6th assessment report recognizes the concept of maladaptation. So that is something that is ostensibly or supposed to be climate change adaptation, but it's not well thought through or well implemented and leads to unintended consequences. So a very common example used there is that perhaps in an area where the coast is vulnerable to storm surges and that combined with rising sea levels creates damage, is to build seawalls, like the dikes that they do have in the Netherlands. But then that sort of thing can cause flooding sort of up the coast and down the coast from those locations, sort of either diverting the damage or causing more damage holistically. That assessment report also recognizes how adaptation and mitigation can combine, for example, strengthening certain ecosystem services, restoring grasslands or forests, for example, will store more carbon, but it'll also attenuate floodwater. So that could be a way where adaptation and mitigation is combined, and that is not recognized in this adaptation plan. And then also very importantly, how certain opportunities for adaptation close with time. We can do them now, we can do them in the next 3 years, but we can't do them 8 years from now because the circumstances have gone that far that adaptation is not possible. I think what's really missing from both this plan and from the state's actions is the sense of urgency. So the plan does have an implementation framework, but there are no timeframes to that. So that sense of urgency is not there. Much of what is in this plan is then being captured in what is now the Climate Change Act. So that act sort of breaks down various adaptation measures that can be taken or must be taken. Their obligations on national, provincial, and local government, but the deadline for those are very far away, in some cases as far as 5 years away from the operationalization of the Act. And although the Act's been signed by the President, it hasn't been proclaimed, so it's not yet operational. And so those timeframes are not yet running, and that is very problematic. Other limitations in the plan, there's very little, if any, mention of the youth. We know that the nature of climate change is such that it's today's youth and future generations that are really going to bear the brunt, and that is not adequately captured in there. Although it speaks about participatory democracy and a bottom-up approach, in practice, when we look into the content of that, that's very little of that there. And this is critically important. It would not be appropriate for centralized top-down approach to be the only significant voice in climate adaptation. At the end of the day, people in vulnerable communities or small businesses or whatever the case might be understand their needs the best. So it's really important that that feedback comes back up and that the nitty-gritty of the adaptation plans are formed jointly. Just to also pick up on something that Kira said around decentralized infrastructure. So the plan actually talks about decentralized and adaptive energy system, for example. So that would be small modular solar farms and that kind of thing. So in principle, that value is put there. But then if we look at the dissonance between that and what's actually going on in the energy planning in the country, which is talking about more coal-fired power stations, gas to power, nuclear plants, which are anything but decentralized. In fact, that level of infrastructure is highly vulnerable to climate change impact. So the reality on the ground, the decision making that happens within the state, and then aspirations like this plan really need to harmonize a lot more effectively.
Thanks, Brandon. That's great. I think we should ask Professor Dube now to talk a bit more about the decentralized infrastructure, especially the new norms and standards for buildings. I mean, even homes, new kinds of homes will have to be built. What is the current situation when it comes to building new types of infrastructure, including homes and entire human settlements? And most importantly, how will this be funded? Who's going to pay? And is the money going to be a problem? Maybe you can speak on those points.
Okay. So the adaptation strategy, part of the benefits that I think we have seen, apart I think from the challenges I think that has been highlighted by Brandon, he has managed to trigger a process whereby businesses, government, and also individuals have started to think about how best they can adapt to climate change. And in most instances, if you are to go to a bank today and you are going to ask for some loan, maybe for some project, one of the things that they are going to consider is to consider the issue of climate vulnerability and how that particular entity or business can actually, adapt. So in many respects, the building codes, I think that we have seen, and I think we have also seen, I think a lot of talk about green buildings. So this does not only talk to issues of climate change mitigation, but also speaks about having resilient buildings, smart buildings that are in many respects efficient. And what we have sort of seen is an increased uptake in some of the latest technology that ensures that we have adapted to climate change. If you think, like I was giving an example, if you think about the day zero, for example, if you move into any hotel that is in Cape Town, or most buildings, you will see that they have installed some water efficient technologies, which allows that particular community to adapt, I think, to the new normal that we have seen, particularly with regards to issues of water challenges. South Africa is a water scarce country. We have also seen, I think, a lot of private players, the private homes. When you're thinking about redesigning your homes, I think there's a bit of trickling of that particular understanding to say, when I'm building infrastructure, this infrastructure has to be adapted to climate change. But I think from also architectures of our buildings in terms of our infrastructure, that understanding of saying some of the buildings maybe that had a maximum 100-year probable flood, I think there's that consciousness to say, when we are building, in some instances, we are seeing these buildings, the concept of building back better and stronger coming into essence. But this is still, in many respects, at a low scale, which takes us back, I think, to the issue of retrofits. In as much as people might want to, retrofit their buildings, infrastructure, so that it's more climate resilient, what is lacking is finance. And sometimes also some of the latest technology that is there, the transfer of that technology from the developed countries to our countries is happening at a slow pace. And this, I think, the issue of climate change adaptation, the issue of the climate change adaptation strategy also has to be understood in the context of where the country finds itself and where the world finds itself. I think soon after the strategy was established, we saw the COVID-19 pandemic, which increased, I think, the poverty levels. And one of the things that then does is that it takes away, in terms of prioritizing resources, we do not see that a lot of prioritization coming into place. But we have also seen, I think, challenges with regards to governance, particularly in our municipalities. And I think we all woke up, I think was it about last week, where the Auditor General was talking about, the deterioration in terms of governance. all these issues, also we have seen, I think, an indication of lack of skills within our municipalities, which have hampered the adoption of the climate change strategy, the initiatives, but also it's had negative implications in terms of the rate at which the country can adapt. Needless to say that part of the adaptation, part of what the adaptation strategy talks about is the issue of early warning systems. I think South Africa is one of the countries that have got a robust early warning systems. I guarantee you with some degree of confidence that if there's a danger warning that is issued by source, that danger warning, you have got some certain level of trust and also reliability. And in that space, we have seen, I think, some developments that are coming into the fore. However, I believe that a lot needs to be done, but this depends on availability of finances, which is one of the challenges that we are seeing. There isn't a lot of finances that is available for us to adapt at the rate that we would require. And that have got implications on our buildings in infrastructure and what we can do and what we can't do. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Prof. And any comments on where that finance should be coming from? Because obviously it has to come at some point.
So we need to bring all finances. So we need private capital to be brought to the fore. We need government capital. We need also, I think, capital that comes from, I think, the forums such as the World Bank. I think we have seen a lot of, one of the things that we saw during COVID-19 was the ability of the world to come together to fight a common cause. But what we have not seen, I think, is that appetite to actually throw a lot of financing into capital projects. And some of these projects that are aimed at climate finances, we have not seen, I think, the amount of money that we have seen. Particularly, look at the wars that we have seen in the past couple of years. How many trillions of dollars have been spent? Those funds could have been directed towards ensuring that the world have adapted and also mitigated against the impacts of climate change. So with regards to finances, it's private, the bankers, government, us as individuals also need to come to the fore to ensure that we tackle this particular problem that we are all facing. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. So before we go to Dr. Khanyile, I'd just like to ask Brandon to also come back in on the issue of financing climate adaptation and just give us your perspective on that quickly.
Thank you. Yes, so the plan does talk about mainstreaming adaptation in budgetary processes at national, provincial, and local level. So we really want to see that start happening. It can't be treated as the side issue which needs to sort of queue. It's really got to be woven into thinking around expenditure at all levels. According to a World Bank report from 2022, our adaptation costs needs until 2030 are going to be 866 billion. And by 2050, that goes up to 2.4 trillion. So one of the intentions of the Paris Agreement and its sort of global architecture there is to kind of redress inequity from the past. So those nations that have gotten rich from colonization and from emitting and really you can say effectively have caused the crisis we're in, at least predominantly, are supposed to be putting money into adaptation funds, for example. So there was 100 billion that was pledged by the developed nations in 2020 already, and that's sort of 4 years later, it's still not come. We still haven't seen that money coming through. So we do need to see the global south keep the pressure on the global north to really pay for that and start funding those activities. But we also can't wait. That money might not come. So we also need to look at, who's benefiting or profiting from the climate crisis. And it's predominantly the fossil fuel industry. That industry makes up to $3 billion a day revenue, according to some studies. So they rake all that money in, the shareholders go and stash it away, and everybody else is left to pick up the pieces. So that is really one of the fundamental fights that we're going to be seeing. We're already seeing certain We're seeing a number of court cases around the world where fossil fuel companies are being targeted. We did a research report based on the Durban floods around exactly that. How could we hold those large emitters accountable? And ultimately, you know, that's where money for adaptation and for compensation for loss and damage does need to come from. We see mitigation, and I see this is one of the questions, get the lion's share of financing, and adaptation gets a really tiny amount. And the reason for that is mitigation projects are profitable. Even switching from fossil fuels to renewables, there are service providers and manufacturers that get to make a profit out of that. Adaptation is not as profitable. So the climate crisis is really a result of a very skewed economic system where people and planet continue to get exploited. And that's ultimately the thing that's got to get upended to bring equity into this and have the resources channeled in the right direction.
And do you want to quickly just outline for us the difference between the mitigation and adaptation projects?
So mitigation is reducing greenhouse gases. So very simply, a mitigation action, particularly in this country, would be to close down the coal plants and to build renewable energy. So that is, how do we mitigate our impact on the climate? Whereas adaptation says that those, you know, no matter how well we mitigate, the impacts are coming and they're intensifying. How do we adapt to those that are coming? And then loss and damage is how do we mop up and compensate for those who've actually suffered the loss. So yeah.
Thanks, Brandon. I want to move to Dr. Khanyile now. Dr. Khanyile of the Gauteng City Region Observatory, you've been involved in evaluating green assets in Gauteng. So maybe you can just talk us through what green infrastructure and assets are. Why are they important, and what were your findings on the green infrastructure in Gauteng?
Thank you, Anna. First off, let me just introduce the Gauteng City Region Observatory. We are an institutional collaboration between the University of the Witwatersrand, the University of Johannesburg, and Gauteng provincial government and local government. We build the knowledge needed by government, businesses, and stakeholders to develop strategies for a competitive, sustainable, as well as inclusive Gauteng City region. We have a range of projects on our research agenda that resonate with the climate adaptation strategy. And one such initiative, as you've already mentioned, is our Green Assets and Infrastructure Project, which examines the state of green infrastructure in the Gauteng City region, and is also aimed at influencing green asset management and incorporation into government processes and planning processes. What are green assets and infrastructure? Green assets are natural and planted ecological features, and green infrastructure refers to the connection between these assets, which then works together and provide services which are similar to your traditional grey infrastructure. Green assets and infrastructure approach then supports like climate change adaptation, the mitigation of urban issues such as heat islands, pollution, flooding, absorbs greenhouse gases, as well as enhances resilience. So in our project, we have several findings which I'll be listing. One of them is that we found that there's an unequal distribution in green assets and infrastructure, meaning they're not evenly spread or accessible to everyone, particularly in disadvantaged communities. So many of your green assets will be in wealthier suburbs, while previously disadvantaged communities have very little access to green assets and green infrastructure, for example, parks. Also, previously disadvantaged communities are mostly characterized by impervious surfaces, which then increases flood risk. Where you get green assets, for example, your wetlands, most of them have been degraded and have very low functionality. And in most cases, this will be where there is unregulated development on a wetland, which then disturbs the ecological integrity as well as the function of the wetland. Another finding is that there are actually quite a number of greening initiatives in the Gauteng province, which are then aimed at remedying and addressing some of these disparities. Most of them are in the form of tree planting. Although the focus there is mostly from a conservation angle, rather than a holistic approach, which looks at natural resource management as well as ecological resilience. And then we've also found that despite increasing policy interest in green infrastructure, traditional solutions to urban problems still persist, and they are mostly dominant. We work really closely with our government partners, and through that process, it was revealed that this is partly due to a lack of evidence and concrete examples and practical guidelines for implementing green infrastructure and introducing it where you have your traditional grey infrastructure to help with the resilience of those systems. As part of the project, then we conducted several case studies. For example, in Diepsloot, we tested low-cost green infrastructure solutions for managing surface water issues. Diepsloot is an informal settlement in Johannesburg. So for this project, it was a partnership with a local organization in Diepsloot called WhatsApp. This case study was particularly important because there aren't many examples of how a green infrastructure approach can be implemented in an informal setting, especially in the global south. So for this case study, we also incorporated local knowledge systems in order to address issues which were related to, for instance, communal toilets, wastewater disposal, as well as some of the stormwater and surface water issues. The key interventions that we introduced there were permeable paving, as well as rain gardens. We noted improvements in water quality, but we also noted the importance of community engagement for successful green infrastructure solutions in informal settlements. In another case study, we worked with a group of engineers to conduct a cost-benefit analysis of the Atlas Sprayed flood relief scheme in Ekurhuleni, where we compared traditional grey and green infrastructure approaches. And this project basically involved designing an artificial wetland in order to manage the storm water in the area. And the analysis then compared the costs, including construction and the maintenance of the green infrastructure that had been introduced. We assessed the impacts on the well-being, ecosystem services, as well as property values in the area. The finding was that the green infrastructure scheme's capital cost is very similar to that of your traditional grey infrastructure, but we do find that the green infrastructure scheme outperforms the grey scheme in terms of ecological benefits, as well as improving your habitat improvement, which normally wouldn't be possible with your traditional grey infrastructure. Another finding, which has already been mentioned by previous panelists, was that of increasing environmental events and disasters. In our research, we have found that it affects everyone. These disasters affect everyone, regardless of your income group, whether you live in an informal dwelling or a formal dwelling. But we've also found that the vulnerability and the impact of these disasters is not the same. Wealthier households can shield themselves from some of the impacts, while the urban poor, especially in informal settlements, are most affected by these disasters. Vulnerability varies, and it is shaped by many factors. It is shaped by social, economic, and your environmental factors. We engaged in a process whereby we worked on a social vulnerability index with the Gauteng Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. And there we looked at combining factors like your access to services, transport, communication, education levels, which also play a role in terms of like one's risk. Everyday risks accumulate over time, increasing, your vulnerability to hazards and floods. And the findings from this exercise then was that there's high vulnerability seen in areas like Soweto, Diepsloot, Mamelodi, Sebokeng, Tembisa. These are township areas. And then when you look at wealthier areas like Centurion and Sandton, there's less vulnerability in those areas. But then we also found that in dense areas or in densely populated areas, there's actually a mix of vulnerability. You will find vulnerable groups next to less vulnerable people, and that basically has an impact on our emergency response efforts, and it's something that should be looked into, because whatever emergency or crisis response effort, it needs to be contextualized to fit the area that is being targeted. So as I mentioned, we have a range of projects that look at sustainability related themes, and what I was talking about now is also related to a project where we were looking at how urban elites are seceding state-provided infrastructure in favor of private energy and water sources. While this is very positive from a climate perspective, we're finding that it raises affordability concerns, and it stands the risk of exacerbating existing inequality in the region. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Dr. Khanyile. That's really great. So I think, you've outlined so many projects that are happening. Is there enough happening in Gauteng? I mean, in terms of, okay, it's very nice to have permeable pavements and Diepsloot and so on, but you spoke about how the townships are really still highly vulnerable. So in your opinion, is there enough happening? And how fast could these areas be really adapted for climate change? Maybe just briefly.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
I think I'll go back to what I said earlier about how the GCRO, the Gauteng City Region Observatory, builds a knowledge base needed by government, businesses, and stakeholders. So from my perspective, I would really just say, here's the data. The data is freely available. It is publicly available. It is online. So whoever is working, at looking at how far things have come, should really consider looking at the data, and they can get better insights into what still needs to be done. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. I think we've got quite a lot of questions coming through, so maybe we should move into them now in case we run out of time. Maybe I can give you this question, Dr. Erwin. I'll read it out. 50% of South Africans do not know that climate change exists, according to Afrobarometer. We're also a developing, highly consumer-based society where bigger and more is better and to be aspired to. So how do we have the conversations about eating less meat, driving smaller cars and using public transport, using less power, buying less fast fashion and single-use throwaway items? And then this questioner is saying that the demands of climate change adaptation actually challenge a lot of our current values and materialistic cultures. So how do we find ways around this? Maybe you can take that one.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for that question. And I think your question points to what really sits at the heart of what we're talking about today, which is that, capitalism is a cause of climate change, and the kind of inequality that it breeds in our society means that we are sitting with a very a kind of pressing issue to say, how is it possible that the small majority of the middle class and above are actually the biggest polluters, yet they are able to protect themselves more from the damage that comes from these severe weather events? And you're right. Certainly, we do need big media sort of pushes to try and conscientize those of us who have more access to wealth and who are, in fact, perpetuating often these both inequalities, but very dangerous consumerist practices, which are leading to this. And on the other hand, certainly in my view, we really require a caring, functional state. One of the biggest protections people have against exploitation, and probably one of the biggest protections even other species and the planet have at the moment, is to have a political will to actually put in regulations and monitor them and hold people accountable. That means that really, Brandon spoke about it earlier, like we have to change the system of inequality. It, in the end, is killing us all, just some of us more quickly. So yes, you're right, consumerism is a massive issue, but actually what we need is we need a functional caring state at different levels to start to regulate what is happening so that that terrible imbalance that we're stuck in really starts to get swayed back to a far more equal society. Sorry, I know that's not an easy response to that, but this is where we have to go, I think.
It's a good response. Thanks for that. Professor Dube, I have 2 questions for you. The first one, please expand on what a green building is. What does this mean in a layperson's terms? And the second one is, are the building codes and bylaws keeping up with the rate of climate change that we are seeing?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the very, I think, insightful question. So a green building, in simple, is a building that that is smart. let's call it that way. So in terms of the design specifications that would have gone into it, one considers the local climatic parameters. So for example, in many respects, in South Africa, perhaps one of the things that a building might need to be responsive to is the increase in temperature. So when we are building this particular structure, a house, we are building a house that is temperature resistant in terms of the designs of the buildings or the material that is actually used in terms of walling, in terms of the design of the windows, in terms of the direction that it is facing. It takes into consideration, I think, the issues that has to do with climate change, but also in terms of water, which is a scarce commodity. When we are building that particular building, we make sure that it is water efficient. How do we do that? We put in the taps such as low flow shower heads, some gauzes so that the water does not, the building is water efficient. So there are so many aspects that we can put it in terms of waste management. We design this with regards to respect to how does this building incorporate the issue of waste management. So there's a lot that can actually be done, and we have seen quite a number of buildings that are green, from either general building, government buildings. I think we have got one building that is in Tshwane, which is actually quite a number of buildings. If you go to Sandton, we've got quite a number of certified buildings, which are certified by some of the buildings that are certified by Green Council of South Africa. So in terms of also energy, these buildings are energy efficient. We make sure that the lighting that gets into it is also energy efficient. In some respects, you can input, I think, renewable energy. It could be solar installation. So these are buildings that we are seeing that can actually be used in terms of responding to the issue of climate change. With regards to the second question, what we are seeing is that in terms of the building codes and also the developments along our infrastructure, they are failing to keep up, I think, with because I think most of the codes that were designed, it takes actually a lot of time for these codes to actually be adopted and be approved, and that, so that they can be used. And what we are seeing is that the extreme weather events that we're experiencing, they actually surpass what has actually been predicted by climate change models. So in many respects, we are overtopping, I think, the climate the parameters that we are seeing, both in terms of the world. I think in South Africa, we are warming faster, I think 2 times faster than the rest of the world. And when I was checking temperature anomalies for August, I realized that some of the areas actually by 5 degrees, they are higher by about 5 degrees Celsius. So in terms of those codes actually catching up, they're trying to play catch up, but I think we are lagging in many respects, and we need to get to a comfortable position whereby our codes actually talks to the future. But that future needs to be reimagined. I think there was lots of issues with climate change models being able to predict with precision what is going to happen, particularly in Southern Africa. And so the level of uncertainties within our models filters and trickles in through to all the decisions that we make with regards to climate change. And that catch-up process is what we are seeing. And that leg is what we are seeing also permeating into the either PH strategies and also the some of the initiatives that we take. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. And if anyone has a follow-up question on that, please put it in the Q&A. Brandon, I have a few questions for you. You mentioned the 866 billion that we'll need by 2030, and I think you said 2.4 trillion by 2050 just to adapt South Africa to climate change. There's a question. The first question is, are those costs in US dollars or rands? That's from Gordon. Then the second question is from Ntumba Katabua. Given that South Africa's needs are more related to adaptation because we're already feeling the effects of climate change compared to greenhouse gas mitigation, of which our contribution is quite negligible, 1%, why is it that the JET investment plans are all focused on mitigation with very, very little focus on adaptation? And what would it take for us to direct and channel investments, local and foreign investments, to the crucial subject of adaptation? That's for you, Brandon.
Thanks, Anna. I must check on those figures, which I can do and put it in the chat. I think it's dollars, but I must have a look.
Thanks.
In terms of the question on the JET and mitigation and adaptation, I mean, in a way, it's the nature of the JET. It's the just energy transition. It comes from the just energy transition planning that Eskom has been doing, for example, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is the $8.5 billion that came from the US, the UK, Germany, the EU, and so on. And then the JET investment plan, which came from the presidency, which is to respond to that money coming in. So almost by definition, the parameters are about climate change mitigation. And in our case, the reason we attract finance like that is because we're so dependent on coal-fired power that while it's not simple or cheap, it's kind of easy in a way to do that mitigation. The costs of decarbonizing for South Africa are less than most countries in the world. So that is why, and as I said earlier, when I was trying to proactively answer this question, I think mitigation is sexy and there's return on investment. It's about technology, it's about service providers. Adaptation, not so much. I mean, the big infrastructure projects which will be sold as being adaptation, and in some cases maybe, obviously sort of generate economic activity and jobs, and there's money in it for those that construct it. But the depth and breadth of adaptation and sort of non-big infrastructure and all of that doesn't return that, doesn't give that kind of return on investment, which is why it's generally not that attractive. And this is one of the things that needs to be changed. There's a lot of short-termism here, which is part of the problem. I mean, political parties think in terms of election cycles. The business environment thinks in terms of quarters and perhaps financial years. And really, if we look at what's coming down the line, the costs of not adapting properly are going to dwarf the costs of adapting. So what is it going to take to get that long-term thinking where we actually value society and life and well-being over these short-term profits? Because until that thinking really starts changing, we're going to see mitigation projects and not that much happening in terms of adaptation.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Brandon. I have a question. You'll have to see who wants to answer it. From Hubert van Eerden at Stellenbosch, who's been doing a lot of research and development of electric vehicles. Okay, so I don't know who's prepared for this one. Has someone calculated the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions since the Industrial Revolution? The cost of damage should be carried by the responsible countries, not all countries equally going forward.
I don't mind. Yes, Brandon, you're probably better placed to answer that. Go for it.
Okay, thanks, Brandon.
Or maybe not, Kira, but yeah, let me give it a go. I mean, those have been calculated. There's an academic called Richard Eads who has, what's the name of his project? But anyway, he developed the carbon majors list, for example. And that project, and I think it's the carbon display, I'm not sure, goes back to actually the early 1800s. And it looks at all of those emissions. So those are broken down by country. The USA is responsible for the bulk of the historical emissions. China is responsible for the bulk of today's emissions. But it's all there, and it's also broken up into single source emissions. So there's a list of the 100 carbon majors, the largest emitting companies generally in the world. Nearly all of those are fossil fuel companies, with a few of them being cement companies. So the accounting is all able to be done. It can be tracked, and hopefully in due course, proper accountability can be apportioned.
Thank you. We've got a few more questions. I don't know if one person could just answer these two very quickly. From Alan Kennedy Assa, what time horizons does this climate change adaptation strategy plan for? Is it planning for just the up to 2050 or 2050 to 2100 or 2100 and beyond? And then we have Shakira Kwabe. By way of funding climate mitigation measures, how possible is it to utilize capital raised through carbon credits? We just need someone to answer those very quickly, and then we can start wrapping up. Thank you. Anyone?
So the
Good, thanks.
study runs up to 2030. And the second question is on. Sorry, the second question is on?
Second question is how possible is it to use capital raised through carbon credits to fund climate mitigation?
A lot of funds that are raised from the carbon market are actually used as offsets for climate change mitigation. So yeah, those are part of the market-based measures of trying to address the issue of climate change. So when you pay for carbon credits, those credits, they go for climate change mitigation. And I think a little bit of, in some instances, a little bit of climate change adaptation strategies as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've got one final question from Tyler Clutie, and there's another comment on the chat about some accounting from the World Resources Institute that people can look at on the chat if they want. So Tyler is asking if everybody could go into more details regarding the challenges regarding the National Climate Change ADAPT strategy beyond just the financial constraints, because it's easy to say, well, there's billions needed here and nobody has the money. What Tyler is asking is a very pertinent question. How do we hold the government accountable? So can we each take 2 to 3 minutes, and could we go to Dr. Khanyile first?
Right. Thank you. I think I can speak to the constraints yeah, but not from a financial perspective. One constraint is, I don't know, data. We conduct a lot of research in terms of climate change in South Africa, but also some of this data is not readily available. And I mean, municipalities will do will have interventions, like some of the interventions I mentioned earlier. And the issue there is that some of the data that they have is not comparable. And so you can't really use that data together in order to get some proper insight into what's happening. So really what we could be doing is sort of forcing the government to, I don't know, have proper or have other processes for making data for collecting good data that can be used to inform some of the policies that we are discussing today, and also good data so that
Has Dr. Khanyile frozen or have? Okay. Dr. Khanyile? Candace? Dr. Khanyile is frozen. I think, okay, we'll come back. Dr. Khanyile, are you there?
I think she's frozen, Anna. Let's move on to get.
Okay. Let's maybe have Professor Dube just wrapping up, what can be done, what should be done, what do you see as the way forward?
Okay, to hold the government accountable, make climate change a voting issue. And I think we have seen quite, coverage of climate change as a voting issue. And I think within our communities, I think let's impress upon our representatives, those that we have got access to ensure that climate change is a big issue. But if you tell a politician that if climate change, if we don't mitigate, if we don't adapt, you're going to lose votes, they will take it seriously. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Let's go to Dr. Erwin. Your final words on this. How do we hold the government accountable?
Yeah, thank you. I think that the approach is going to have to be a plural one, using lots of different strategies and tactics. I would also encourage people actually to put pressure on your local ward councillors and those ward committees. In other words, start thinking in much smaller geographies to get together and think about how you can create more robust, resilient systems that will meet your needs. So yes, of course, to the politicians, but don't forget, local government for many of us actually is where these things need to be implemented. And this is also where we have to really get engaged and make people do what they're often mandated to do, but are not currently implementing.
Thank you. Brandon, your final words on this?
Thanks. Yeah, quickly on Gordon's question, that was actually in Rand values, those costs. A quick question that from Erna around carbon offsetting and greenwashing. Yeah, I think carbon credits and offsetting is a way that money moves around in the system. It's in the Paris Agreement, and it's to be treated with utmost suspicion. I think anything ranging from scams to just really not genuine offsetting. So I don't think it's going to go away, but it really needs to be tightened up a lot, and it would be better if it didn't exist for the most part. Many will disagree with me. And then final words, sort of answering Tyler's questions. I think knowledge building is key. Really getting that awareness out there, joining those dots. The climate literacy is low, but even the sort of higher understanding, and that needs to happen within state functionaries, business decision makers, community leaders, and so on. We need that political will so that there's congruence between these stated aims and decisions. We're still seeing environmental authorizations being granted where there've been no adaptation assessments done. We need more transparency. This information should be made publicly available and it must be inclusive. In terms of holding the state accountable, there are public participation mechanisms in the Climate Change Act around adaptation. Get involved, have your say, go to those meetings. And if the state makes bad decisions, club together and take them to court. You can donate to us, that's what we do. And then vote. I predict that elections are going to be decided on climate mandates in due course. We're not there yet. So political parties would do well to commit to this, and voters would do well to vote for the right parties. Yeah.
Thanks, Brandon. Thank you so much. And Dr. Khanyile, you're back. Would you like to wrap up? Would you like to just take 2 minutes to give your closing remarks? You froze at one point, so I don't know if you said everything you wanted to say.
Thank you. My apologies. I don't know what was happening with my internet, but I'm back. This is one of the many problems we have. I think Brandon has covered it well. We need more transparency, because if we know what's happening, then we can question some of the decisions that are being made. So I'll go back to what I said earlier about the TCRO building a knowledge base. So the data is there. It could really be used to inform some of the decisions and policy making. And it's not only available to government, it's also available to citizens. With, there's an increase in internet connectivity, despite what just happened to me right now, but everybody can access it, online. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to hand back to Candice now, just to say thanks from me to all the panelists. It's been great to have a group of people who are really working hard on climate activism, but from so many different perspectives, the legal perspective, the infrastructure, research perspective. So thank you so much. And I'll hand back to Dr. Bailey.
Thanks so much, Anna. What an insightful conversation. I've learned so much. It was really just such a great conversation. Thank you to all the panelists. It's clear that this is a very complex issue. There's lots of arms, lots of things to discuss. We've just touched the surface, and obviously the conversation is going to continue. To do the official thanks, I'm going to hand over to our General Manager, Millie Phiri, just to officially thank you. But thank you all. Millie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Candice. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Millie Phiri. I'm the General Manager of the conversation. I would like really to sincerely thank all our panelists, Brandon, Drs. Erwin and Khanyile. Thank you so much, as well as Professor Dube. Thank you very much. We wouldn't have asked for a better panelist to discuss these very topical climate issues. Thank you for the insights about what the City of Joburg is doing, civil society, researchers. Your attending this webinar is very important to us. Our conversations wouldn't be complete without your expert views. We started the series 3 years ago in an attempt to really get to policymakers and scientists around the table to discuss issues that are important across our continent, and to share insights and learnings which could potentially lead to some solutions like what we had today. We also wanted to give non-scientists the opportunity to participate in these discussions and learn from these experts and practitioners. And we think that our virtual events have been able to do exactly that. We have covered everything from COVID-19 to elections and insecurity on the continent, and we will continue to do more. So what a great discussion. This was the third in a series of 4 virtual events that we've held in the past few weeks, and we still have one more that we're going to have on climate as well. Please check the chat box for more details. Thank you to all our participants. Without you, there wouldn't be any dialogue at all. Thanks for all the insightful questions. I hope you enjoyed and found it really relevant and useful. And last but not least, I would like to thank our team for putting up a great webinar. Thank you, Anna, thank you, Candice, and thank you, Gary. And on that note, I would really wish you all a good afternoon and thank you very much for participating.